Margaret Colton had never been the kind of person who asked for attention. She had spent 14 years inside Hargrove Memorial Medical Center, doing her job quietly, carefully, and with complete dedication to the patients who depended on her. She arrived early. She stayed late. She remembered the names of every patient she had ever cared for, and she treated each one of them as if they were her own family. The other nurses respected her. The doctors trusted her. The patients loved her. But none of that mattered to Richard Halston. Richard Halston was the CEO of Hargrove Memorial, and he had ruled that hospital like a king for 11 years. He was tall, well-dressed, and spoke with the kind of confident voice that made people feel small without him even trying. He had a large corner office on the 5th floor with a view of the city, a personal assistant who handled his schedule down to the minute, and a reputation for cutting costs in ways that made the board of directors smile and the nursing staff worry. He was the kind of man who saw a hospital not as a place of healing, but as a business. And in his business, nurses who raised concerns were a problem. Maggie had raised a concern, a serious one. For several months, she had noticed something deeply troubling in the ICU. The supply of certain medications, pain management medications that critically ill patients depended on, was running low far too often. At first, she assumed it was a shipping delay. Then she assumed it was a budget issue. But the pattern continued, week after week, and patients were suffering because of it. She had seen elderly patients in visible discomfort because the medications listed in their care plans were simply not available in the quantities they were supposed to be. She had documented everything carefully, dates, patient records, medication logs, and submitted a formal written complaint to hospital management. She expected a conversation. She received something else entirely. On a cold Tuesday morning in February, Richard Halston called a full staff assembly in the hospital's main conference hall. 200 employees gathered: nurses, administrators, doctors, interns, and support staff. Maggie stood near the back, unsure why the meeting had been called. She found out quickly. Halston stood at the front of the room with a microphone in his hand and looked out at the crowd. Then, without any introduction or explanation, he called her name. He said that a complaint had been filed by one of the nursing staff, and he named her directly. He said the complaint was an example of the kind of dramatic, uninformed thinking that drives up hospital costs. He said that nurses who did not understand the financial realities of healthcare management should focus on their own responsibilities rather than inventing problems. He smiled slightly as he spoke, as if the whole matter was both irritating and mildly amusing to him. Maggie did not move. She did not speak. She felt 200 pairs of eyes turned toward her, and she absorbed it all without flinching. Her face was calm. Her hands were still. 14 years of difficult nights in the ICU had taught her how to hold herself together when everything around her was falling apart. She nodded once, very slightly, and when the meeting ended, she walked back to her station and began her shift. She cried in her car during her lunch break. Then she went back inside and finished her work. That evening, she called her brother. Daniel Colton was not a man who said much over the phone. He was 42 years old, and he had spent 14 years as a Navy SEAL before transitioning into a federal role as a K-9 handler for a joint task force that investigated financial crimes and fraud in institutional settings. His partner was a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois named Recon, sharp, disciplined, and trained to detect things that human investigators often missed. Daniel had seen a great deal of the world during his time in service, and very little of it had surprised him. But listening to his sister's voice that evening, flat and controlled in the way that meant she was holding something painful very tightly, he felt something shift inside him. He asked her one question before he said goodnight. What is Halston hiding? It was not an accusation. It was simply the way Daniel's mind worked. He had learned over many years that when a powerful person goes out of their way to publicly punish someone for raising a concern, it usually means the concern was getting close to something real. He began making quiet inquiries through his task force contacts. He was careful and methodical, the way he had been trained to be. Within 48 hours, something came back that made him sit forward in his chair. Hargrove Memorial Medical Center had been flagged 18 months earlier during a routine federal healthcare audit. The flag had noted irregularities in the hospital's pharmaceutical inventory records. specifically in the ICU and pharmacy departments. The audit had never been completed. The file had been quietly closed before investigators could dig deeper, and the person who had authorized that closure had done so through a legal intermediary whose connections, when traced carefully, led back to one name: Richard Halston. Daniel requested a formal compliance review of Hargrove Memorial through his task force. It was fully authorized and completely routine on paper. He brought recon with him on the inspection day, walking through the hospital alongside 2 federal auditors, moving through storage rooms and administrative areas with calm professionalism. The hospital staff saw a compliance visit. They had no reason to think otherwise. Recon was trained to alert on a wide range of materials, not just the things most people associate with detection dogs, but also specific chemical compounds used in pharmaceutical products, as well as materials linked to document fraud and improper storage. He was extraordinarily good at his work. His nose could detect traces of something that had been handled in a room days earlier. Halfway through the walkthrough, Recon stopped. He was standing in a corridor adjacent to the hospital pharmacy, beside a storage room that had no official label on its door and no listing in the hospital's floor plan documentation. His body went still and focused in the way that Daniel knew immediately and without any doubt. Daniel signaled to the auditors. They called for authorization. Within the hour, the room was legally opened. Behind a false back panel that had been installed to look like a section of shelving, investigators found sealed containers holding pharmaceutical-grade controlled substances, far more than any legitimate hospital storage requirement could explain. They found medication logs that had been carefully falsified, with dates and quantities altered to conceal what had actually been happening over the past 4 years. And they found a phone, a basic, untraceable model, that contained encrypted messages between Halston and 2 individuals who were already known to federal investigators as black market distributors of controlled medical substances. The picture came together quickly after that. For years, Richard Halston had been running a diversion scheme inside his own hospital. He had been systematically redirecting controlled medications, the same medications that ICU patients were supposed to receive, and selling them through a network of corrupt suppliers. The shortages that Maggie had reported were not accidents. They were the result of a calculated, ongoing operation that Halston had built carefully and concealed behind layers of paperwork, complicit pharmacists, and falsified records. The money had been laundered through a medical foundation that Halston controlled personally. That foundation had funded a real estate portfolio across 3 states, all in his name. Patients had suffered because of what he had done. In at least 3 cases that investigators documented, seriously ill patients had experienced prolonged pain during their care because the medications prescribed for them had been diverted before they reached the ICU. These were real people who had trusted the hospital to care for them at their most vulnerable, and they had been let down by a man who saw the institution as nothing more than a source of personal profit. Halston was arrested on a Thursday morning, 22 days after he had stood in front of 200 employees and used Maggie's name to mock her. Federal agents arrived at the hospital at 7:15 in the morning, before his first scheduled meeting of the day. He was escorted through the lobby and out through the main entrance in full view of the nursing staff arriving for the morning shift. He said nothing. His silver cufflinks caught the light, as he walked past the same doors he had walked through with such certainty for 11 years. The charges were serious and extensive: healthcare fraud, pharmaceutical diversion, money laundering, and criminal negligence related to patient harm. The federal indictment was 47 pages long. Maggie was not in the lobby when it happened. She was in the ICU, sitting beside a patient, an 81-year-old retired schoolteacher named Gerald, who was recovering from heart surgery and liked to talk about his garden when he felt strong enough. She received a text message from a colleague with a photograph attached, but she set the phone face down on the counter beside her and asked Gerald if he needed anything. He said he was comfortable. She stayed with him until the next nurse arrived. Her original complaint, the one Halston had used to humiliate her in front of the entire staff, was entered as Exhibit 1 in the federal indictment. Investigators noted that it had been the first formal documentation to bring the medication irregularities to official attention, and that it had ultimately created the paper trail that led directly to the discovery of the diversion scheme. Without her complaint, they wrote in their report, the investigation may have taken significantly longer, or may never have been initiated at all. The hospital board issued a formal public apology to Maggie. They offered to read it aloud at another full staff assembly if she wished. She thanked them and said that would not be necessary. She continued her shifts. She continued sitting with patients. She continued showing up early and staying late. Daniel was never named in any public report connected to the case. His role in initiating the inquiry was documented internally within the task force and left there. He had not done it for recognition. He had done it because his sister's voice had told him something was wrong, and in his experience, when someone who never complains finally speaks up, it is almost always worth listening. Recon received a commendation from the task force, a formal notation in his service record, which meant nothing to him. What mattered to him was the full bag of treats that Daniel gave him on the drive home, and the long run they went on together the following morning, through the empty fields near their house. What happened at Hargrove Memorial was not unique. Across the country, there are institutions led by people who confuse authority with integrity, and who believe that their position protects them from accountability. They surround themselves with people who agree with them, and they treat anyone who raises a concern as a threat rather than a resource. They become very good at building systems that hide what they are doing, until something or someone finds the one thing they missed. In this case, that something had 4 legs, an extraordinary nose, and an unshakable focus. And the one who sent him in was a quiet woman who had documented every date, every shortage, and every patient name, and had submitted a formal complaint through proper channels, and had stood in a room full of people while a powerful man used her name to make himself sound reasonable, and had not broken. That is the part that stays with the people who were there that day. Not the arrest, not the investigation, not the charges. It is the image of Maggie Colton standing at the back of that conference room, absorbing every word, saying nothing, and then going straight back to her patients. She was never dramatic, she was never uninformed, she was simply paying attention, in the careful and dedicated way she had been paying attention for 14 years. And in the end, that was more than enough.